Good afternoon. I'm here on Sense Space with Matthew Green and Mahon McCann, and this is the Resonant Man Dialogues. Continue today with somebody who I've had a number of dialogues around masculinity, wrestling with philosophy, wrestling with religion. Mahon writes the Wisdom Dojo. He has his own podcast. He writes essays addressing the meaning crisis. He's definitely someone who's full on wrestling, not only in philosophy, but also with probably big, scary men in the context of MMA gyms where he trains. So it's really good to have you on, Mahon, and I'm really
Physically
keen to
and
see.
metaphorically wrestling. I think the physical one's sometimes easier, but thank you very much, Jacob. It's awesome to be here, man. Talk about this topic, topic that's close to my heart as well. So hopefully, yeah, we can provide some interesting tools for any men that might be listening or for people who want to understand it. So it's an important topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And alongside, I have my collaborator, my co-creator of the Resonant Man, Matthew Green, also writer, also space holder and facilitator, and somebody who's really putting all of his heart and soul, I feel, into creating this space of authenticity and possibility of transformation for other men. And yeah, it's the spirit of emergence that's really guided this whole process, I would say, from the outset of our relationship and our collaboration and holding dialogues around ancestry and healing from war and holding dialogues on climate and collective consciousness. And then ultimately, both of us realizing we really feel there's something here in this men's space work, in this wisdom oriented men's work. And so therein arose the resonant man and has been slowly taking form before our eyes and between us. And I think that's just important to share because that spirit of not just like, oh, let's do a men's project and let's kind of lock it in and design it all beforehand and then we'll go out and mega sell it or something. Like that's not been the approach here. It's really been tuning in between the two of us, finding the wisdom field ultimately and seeing like what wants to come through, where does this thing want to go. And as we did that, we just became really clear, like, oh, there's a dialogos current between us here that has a fidelity to it that we really want to invite others into. So yeah, welcome Matthew as well.
Thank you, Jacob.
Yeah, I'm just taking a moment now to sense into the fact that we're all here, men come together to engage in a dialogue and sense into some of the deeper meaning, the deeper horizons of what it means to be a man, to be men together, what that can offer to us, what's particular about that for us in our lives, and yeah, I invite both of you to kind of just sense into what comes up immediately and intuitively in relationship to that. And then perhaps we can weave in some of the elements that Matthew and I have been developing with the Resonant Man and that Mahon and I have been exploring in the context of our dialogues as well.
Yeah, I mean that sounds good, man. What's coming up for me really is a bit of the almost problematizing the current. I think it's a weird time to be a man because because of the culture war, really, and because we have such a fractured society, that there's all different opinions. I mean, our maturity in some sense is biological, but I think for men, you hear that said sometimes. I think it's an Indian thing that, men are born twice. You're born once when you're born, and then you have to be born a second time, which is like when you actually you go from being a boy to a man. This idea of like initiation ceremonies, facing a big challenge, actually like taking on your life at some point, like a call to action. I think that's very much missing. I think the internet's filled a void on that. People online in good and bad ways. I mean, the whole Andrew Tate buzz is very much based on that as well, I think. And there's definitely negative elements to it. But I think the problem for a lot of men now is that they don't choose to live because it's so fractured. You kind of have to you're gonna have to pick one way or another way. And so yeah, I think that's what's coming up for me is the complexity of that um landscape for maturing into a man for young guys at the moment. I wonder what you think about that.
Mm. Yeah, I really resonate with that. I think that the landscape we inherit is kind of I see it as fragmented, in some
Mhm.
ways desolate. I think
A desert.
a desert, yeah. I mean, many of us have been fortunate to have fathers around. Some people do not, but that doesn't mean that you don't have an enormous amount of wrestling with what it means to be a man in Western culture today, and a sense of not being well equipped is how I would characterize
Mm.
a lot of that. And there's a sense of like I have to create my own um, ancestral masculine initiatory process. I have to go out and find my own set of mentors. And as you say, the
Mm.
internet has enabled a lot of us to do that. And those, I think being in the podcasting dialogue philosophy space has also allowed me to connect with a lot of men who've really um yeah, had a transformative impact upon me. And there is something about the decorum and the spirit of this kind of philosophy dialogo scene, I think, that does equip people to like be able to navigate that and how to connect with someone who's potentially, of a different generation to you, or more of a mentor type figure, and have a meaningful relationship and have mutual learning. And that's kind of a foundational skill. I think a lot of people can get equipped with that helps jumpstart that. But of course, we do need to actually collectively vision like what are the fundamentals, what are the keys that we're finding in our own experience, or that we can draw down. And I kind of felt you drawing down the hero's journey there, Mahon. Like, what can we draw in that supports this?
Yeah, and recognizing the power of a men's group or space to ground and start to digest and grapple with these questions, because it's having a place to talk actually and share our experience that can be so powerful, on a very simple level, just recognizing that we're very often not alone with the things that we think we're most alone with. And that becomes clear very quickly. But there's also something more, I think, and I've really experienced this in the work I've been doing in spaces dedicated to healing collective and intergenerational trauma, is that when we establish a certain sense of safety, when we deepen the relational field, there is a kind of intelligence that starts to make itself available to us that can really bring us into new perspectives or new relationships with those questions that we're walking, and with one another, that can be very medicinal, I guess, to borrow your phrase, Jacob. and that although these questions loom large, and that word desert, Mahon, that you used was very striking to me. Like, wow, to look out on a desert is a pretty dramatic image. And yet, in this desert, when we find each other and move into fellowship, again, Jacob, a word I'm borrowing from you, we start to see things that we wouldn't have seen otherwise, and possibilities open up that otherwise might have remained closed. So I think that's what I feel. I feel a real excitement around what becomes possible when we gather a group like this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the internet has kind of facilitated that in a way, I think, for a lot of men to talk to each other and to find role models that are I think what you were saying, Jacob, makes a lot of sense as well, that the wisdom work helps you identify good role models over bad ones.
Ooh.
Something I really struggled with as a young guy. I had a lot of issues with my dad, him and my mom. I had a bad relationship. And so with him, I was quite hard to fully just, you know, accept him as a role model. And so I often went looking for role models in other places. And oftentimes they weren't that great. You kind of try and fill that void with somebody else and looking for another person. And I think that in itself can become part of a negative cycle. For me, that was part of a lot of drinking, a lot of kind of stupid tests of endurance, staying up for days, partying, getting caught up in a group that was going a bad way, pretty much. And I think for a lot of young guys, that can become a substitute for a positive role model. I mean, a real father figure, be it God or an actual, man that is a vision of who you could become. And so for me, that's part of the challenge as well as all these kind of what would you call them? Traps, developmental traps that you can become caught in as a man that, you know, on your journey to become, I suppose, mature.
Mm. No, it's really what comes up for me hearing that is the sense that there is a kind of there's a natural inclination towards finding that recognition for men, whether it be from the role model or from the group. But that does seem to be like a recurring dynamic. Like we don't choose that need for recognition and self-realization in the context of a group of other men. All we can do is kind of orient towards what kind of group that is. And I feel like everybody's experience in school kind of reflects that there's usually a spectrum of possibilities in any given environment of which group you can fall in with. But as you say, when we get into the digital space, um, how high is your aspiration and what's guiding that? And I think for us, it's been about connecting with intuition and appreciation of wisdom and appreciation of beauty and finding people who are really coming coming closer to their purpose, closer to their creative um, fulfillment, holding virtues or capacities that I want to more fully embody and realize in myself. And the way that we do that as human males is by actually being in relationship. You know, watching Joe Rogan or something on a podcast can help, but actually being in a dialogue with somebody that's like the real mimetic learning. That's the embodied learning. And that
Mm.
kind of, I felt that just last week, had a amazing dialogue with Ryan Sprague, the conscious cannabis coach. And he also coaches a number of younger men, and his energy and his social wisdom and focus is so just charged up and so intensely positive that I could feel it like ripple through me for like days afterwards. And I could feel like a sense of increased agency in relation to my own emotional states. Um, and that's just one instance of how, these encounters, they ripple through, they change us. And um, that's ultimately, what's been prioritized here. It hasn't been about a search for podcasting fame for
Doesn't
myself.
pay
It's
very well
been
anyway, but
no, but putting that self-development first, and ultimately that's in service of the collective, I think.
So much was starting to come up for me as you were both speaking. I was almost surprised actually at suddenly how much was present for me. And I'd like to respond, Jacob, to something you said at the start about this desire to connect with intuition, beauty. Like what we might classically think of as more feminine qualities, right? And it occurred to me, it reminded me of something somebody said to me a couple of years ago when I was describing the power of a men's group that I'd been in. And he was saying, well, when there's no women around, the feminine has to be held by men. So there's some natural process that occurs when men are with other men that actually allows their feminine side to kind of come forward, or our feminine side in a way that is quite hard to convey, and kind of could sound slightly weird, but actually is really natural and kind of has a quality to it that allows us then to connect and be men together in a different way from most of the kinds of circumstances where we might be like down the pub, or even in some kind of like, I'm not really, you probably wouldn't find me in a gym, but I kind of imagine if I was to go to a gym, I might not necessarily instantly find myself in a kind of fluid wisdom field of the kind that Jacob you like to describe. So there's something around like how the feminine can have space to emerge among men in a kind of, in a way that's very nourishing and enriching and healthy, actually, that I think is really powerful in a men's space. And the other thing, and there's a lot more I could say on this, but I'll hand it on in a few moments. This whole story of initiation. I mean, I'm 20 years older than you, Jacob. So I've been through my initiations. And for me, it was, without wanting to sound too dramatic, it was going to war as a journalist, as a correspondent. And that was where I sought my initiation. And I, in some ways, found it. And yet I also found it to be unsatisfactory. And there's maybe still a part of me that's still looking for that initiation, but in a very different way. Anyway, there's more maybe to say on that, but I'll hand it over.
Super interesting. Because the initiation, I mean, it was something I was thinking about in advance of this conversation. For some reason, it was just in my head, but because I coach fighters, guys that are going to be fighting in Muay Thai, and also in ninjutsu. And I had one guy that I was coaching, and it was his first fight was coming up, so he was doing like an interclub fight, and he said when he got into the ring for the first time, he had like an existential crisis, like immediately, because he realized as soon as it started that he was the only one in there, and that there was nobody going to come and get him out. He realized that unless he, like, if he just didn't move and stood there, he was going to get knocked out and nobody was going to do anything to stop it. And he said it was like his whole life changed. Like he realized that like outside of the ring, that was the situation he was in. Like if he didn't take action, it wasn't going to happen. And for me, I think that type of training in martial arts was a real revelation of being like, holy shit. Because again, that's something that worries me about the communication aspect of like, there is an element of agency that is very much like nobody can live your life for you in a sense. I don't know if that sounds a bit harsh, but I wonder what you guys think of that, of like that element of masculinity that's like, if it comes down to it, you're the one that's going to have to go, and to have that intrinsic motivation in yourself. I wonder what you think about that.
No, this is really good. I can feel like the dynamic polarity of these two pieces almost is where the maximal generativity of a men's space comes through. Is like the spirit of Sophia, the feminine spirit of wisdom that Matthew's describing, the capacity to be tuned in to others and ourselves and to the collective wisdom of the space, to be attuned to our own soul to some degree as well. And then alongside that capacity to stand on our own 2 feet, the capacity to stand alone as needed, the sense of the physical effect that responsibility takes on, like when you feel yourself responsible for your own security, or this security of your family or something like that. There's a way that that like lands in your body, and you can kind of feel that in other men as well. And I do think there's an extent to which, like, encountering that in other men kind of awakens it in you as well. Like there's a balance there where it's like it is you on your own, and there is an extent to which, if it's what you need, life is going to conspire to create the precise conditions of crisis that bring about that art that is, nascent or unavailable. It's going to, set fire and come alive. But even in that context, you want to have guidance, you want to have feedback, you want to be able to kind of bounce these new energies that are coming in, or these new realizations of like, fuck, I need to get my life in order in these very grounded, pragmatic ways, or I'm having this particular issue with sexuality and relationship to women. It's still very, very valuable and important to be able to bounce those energies in and out. And we kind of, like, I imagine that the form of initiatory culture, the form of an intergenerational culture that we once had, would have been one in which the elder men, having gone through precisely those kinds of one man stands alone initiations, can sense where a younger man is, whether he's moved through that, where he is in that, and can kind of interact with it in a way that brings it forth.
Yeah, well,
Which
I
is
have
not
like,
always. Yeah,
yeah,
please.
because I think you said like I think it's about responsibility of like, and a point where you have to go like, I'm responsibility for whether my life is good or bad or not. Like it's my, it's kind of on me, and I can't make excuses. I can't blame other people. Like I have to, shoulder the burden of making this something worth doing, and of taking care of myself and other people, and that's part of maturity in a way. And also, I'm kind of skeptical about rites of initiation to do that in a sense, because it's like that doesn't happen in just like one moment. It's like you have to make that decision again and again and again. And that for me, because I see in a lot of my friends and stuff and younger guys, like I'm 30 now, and I know guys that are 30 that are still living like they're 20. Like there's no difference. They're doing the same stuff. And so there's been something hasn't changed there, in that like they haven't gone, okay, now I need to change my modeling of the world. Like, the model that worked when I was 16, when I was 18, isn't apt for somebody that's 30 years old. There needs to be that descent into chaos and reforming a new order that'll work for me as an adult. And so I wonder, yeah, do you see, is that resonating? Does that make sense in terms of how you see it?
Matthew, do you want to respond to that, or shall I?
I'd actually be curious to hear your response, Jacob, because I am of a different generation, and when I was growing up, I'm still growing up, but when I was 25, 30, these conversations were not part of my reality. I don't even know if they were really happening. I mean, they must have been happening in some respects, but there wasn't a field of dialogos to enter, and there weren't the thought leaders and philosophers exploring this topic in the way there are now. I mean, I discovered men's work, I think back in about 2017, 18, and it was a revelation to me because I'd been on a path of self-development for some years before that, and it never really occurred to me that there will be something valuable in a men's space. If anything, I was quite skeptical about what that experience would have to offer. So I as I say, I'm kind of looking back, and I recognize that I was in a very particular milieu as a journalist overseas, where we had our kind of code and hierarchy, and we had our badges of honor. We had a whole kind of unwritten system of of self-challenge and initiation, which when I look back, I can see was really performing those functions, but it didn't satisfy. And maybe that speaks, Mahon, to your point that it's not an event of what we're talking about. It's a process. And I wonder what it was still that I was looking for. And I feel like maybe there's something in the initiation. There's a moment where the ingredient is the being seen deeply by other men. I think that's perhaps, and it's just coming to me now that's a really core ingredient. Like once you've emerged from the cave or the forest or whatever proverbial arena you've entered, the mixed martial arts domain, you're seen. You're seen by other men as having conquered your own fears. And I think that feels to me like a very core ingredient of a lot of this. And I was reminded as well of an episode in my own life about, and I've spoken with Jacob about this, when I had a child 6 years ago. That was a huge crisis for me because I didn't feel like I was able to cope with it. And I recognized looking back that I had no men around me who were capable of really holding that or witnessing or helping me to remedy that. There just wasn't a male network, or there was no one really who could sort of intervene on my behalf or be there in the way I needed at that time. And so I recognize that, we have these great absences that I mean, whether we're romanticizing the past or not, we can still imagine that in a more close-knit culture, in more extended family systems, in a kind of bygone era, there may have been a lot more of that available. There would have been restrictions and all kinds of limitations in other ways, but I think there is something about gathering as men in an intentional way that is very deeply rooted and super valuable when it's done in the right way. Yeah.
Yeah. I've just been sensing into that, and like, where does what you've spoken to hold true for me? Like, what have been the key elements that have sort of kicked my ass and caused me to grow? And often it has been that way around, rather than like me out of pure will kind of like generating. It's been a mixture of following what I'm called to, and in the process of that, confronting challenges. A big piece of that, I would say, is that I've undergone several breaks with my social, my kind of born social context. I think that's very, very key to the guy who's still 20 at 30. I can almost guarantee that guy's still with the same group of mates that he was when he was 20. And that, it's very rare, I think, for a group of mates who, from like a younger age, are together to then create a naturally self-evolving, self-developing kind of group space. It's very unlikely, especially when we're in this cultural desert that doesn't even have that kind of filament or aroma moving through the cultural space. Yeah, struggled a lot with looking out for role models all through my early years, finding various kind of charismatic, hard figures who felt like, very, very animating to me, really captured my attention, and struggling an enormous amount with my relationships to women, especially in respect to breakups and just taking these massive, massive hits that I didn't understand. I didn't know how to integrate. And it was because of the absence of being able to integrate those experiences, in part, that I was then seeking out adventure and seeking out deeper experience, I think at some level unconsciously, because I needed to heal and understand these things. And that really started my journey with psychedelics and plant medicine. And that became a space of initiation for me as well, and certainly has been in many ways a series of increasing initiations into myself, into deep states of surrender in some contexts. But that never actually, psychedelics don't do the work for you. Plant medicine doesn't do the work for you. It can show you the way. It can give you an initiatory kind of ritual or ceremony that
Kicking the
kind
ass.
of kick your ass too. But ultimately, then it's the coming out of that. It's the slow building. And for me, it's been about finding those things that feel like they're growing, like capacities that, okay, I'm going to kind of yoke myself to this thing, whether it be dialogue or whether it be my religious searching, whether it be rapping, whether it be um, other creative capacities, like things that I know, like if I'm true to this, it will grow over time. And that's quite distinct from these kind of like stimulating, but ultimately not developing activities that we can engage in socially, video games, just having a laugh, which is important, but having a laugh itself is not, doesn't bear out that quality of this is growing over time. And that's a big piece of what following a wisdom path responds to those moments of nihilism, those moments of crisis, those moments of breakdown, which I think come for all of us. Like they're always coming down the line, and they're very like specifically tailored to our journey. And so these capacities are what allows us to like, like a surfer going into a wave who kind of like dips down and goes through and comes out the other side rather than just getting absolutely washed and taken back to the beach. Like that's the capacity we're talking about. It's not like doing away with waves. It's like I'm set towards a horizon and I've cultivated this capacity to swim toward it. And maybe there's a couple other people swimming in the same direction too. But we're each hitting that wave individually as well. So those are a few of the things. I, two more to tag on. I don't know how this fits for you guys, but I think there's a really interesting dialectic of encountering men who do not respect me. And that's actually been quite important. And like, as someone who probably more like wants to be agreeable, wants to be liked, wants to get on with everybody, like finding those men who just don't respect or don't connect with me, and having walked the strange, spiritual path I've been on, I kind of understand that there are correspondences there and there's reasons for that, but actually not being respected has been really important, alongside that respect that really lifts you up, like being respected by the right man, being engaged by the right man, has a really powerful developmental currency to it as well.
Yeah, I think you want to be respected for doing respectable things. You don't want people just to like blow smoke up your ass if you're behaving in ways that are really stupid. So I feel like there's a good element with other men that's like like they'll slag you when you need to be slagged. Like they'll be like you're being, this is ridiculous, but then also, give you kudos when you need kudos, because you don't want to have just inflate, I suppose, a sense of self-esteem or something. You know, that's that kind of mommy culture of just like you're perfect the way you are. And so often, I mean, I think part of this type of work should be about becoming, really. And I think maybe that's something our culture struggles with as well, because we don't know what we're becoming. I don't know if I'm going to put you on the spot, but like, what do you think the ideal of this work is? Because I think we've talked about this before, Jacob, that like in Christianity, the function of being a man is Christ. Like he's the end game of like that's what you should be like as a man. He has all the virtues, he has all the wisdom. he's decomposed into the various practices, and you're really trying to become, you know, like his character. And so I wonder, do you see a North Star for your work? Or is it something, I don't know, more organic than that? What do you think?
Beautiful,
Yeah,
beautiful
I
question. I'll
could
let
speak.
Matthew go. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're pretty clear that there isn't an ideal template or list of qualities that I mean, or kind of an answer to that question, actually. Like, I think for me, it's much more about allowing a process where certain values are in play. And I think if I was to just experiment with naming some of those, I think learning to be in relationship transparently, learning to really speak from your experience, like rather than about things, really being able to bring yourself forward in your light and your shadow and be seen and witnessed in that and received. I think that's very fundamental, because I think that's something that everyone in our culture struggles with. We're all conditioned to wear masks, to operate from personas, and breaking those personas down is, I think, a big part of the work, so that we can actually find out who we really are underneath. So there's a quality of authenticity, which I think is foundational to what we're inviting in this space. And I think that when we cultivate some basic practices that can help us connect and relate in that transparent way, the process almost takes care of itself. Like, there's so much power in being able to be with ourselves, with other people, or with, especially with other men in this context, to be with what's real, however shadowy or exiled, or however much we may wish to reject parts of ourselves that start to become more visible in that space. Being able to allow them and be witnessed by others is really powerful. There is a healing intelligence that begins to operate when we do that, that can take us in many different directions with no set destination, but will bring a greater level of integration, of groundedness, capacity. And that for me is the essence, in a way. It's what I've seen in other men's groups that have been really well run in the sorts of using some of the sorts of approaches that we're working with. And so so there's no, the agenda is to be like here, in a way. Like, to be here.
And something like authentic communication, in a sense of like teaching like how to feel into your body, how to not
Yeah,
be stuck in your head, how to be able
exactly.
to access those things that can be exiled, as you pointed out. I was kind of hearing some parts work there, which I thought was very interesting. In terms of like reconnecting with things that you might not be consciously aware of. And then also a bit of a Jungian shadow of like the idea that there's stuff outside of your normal consciousness that you have to reintegrate, and articulating that to other people is probably a powerful way of doing it. Does that
Yeah, and
resonate? Does that sound good?
exactly. Yeah, and what happens when we're in a space, in a space together, is that because we're witnessing it in another man, that's what is often the mirror that allows us to see what's going on inside of us with much greater clarity. And so we may be sitting there completely silently, really being very present to another man's sharing or their process. And that can be really working in us. And we may not say anything in that moment. We may not have to speak at all, but it's still working in us and opening layers of awareness, like almost membranes of consciousness starting to kind of dissolve into that greater understanding. And then we may speak about it the following week or in a month, or we may go away and act differently, or speak to our partner differently, or take something away that we can really use in our daily life, and then come back with the wisdom from that. So it is really, for me, about creating the conditions of real safety, trust, and bringing in some pretty basic relational practices. Like I would call it transparent communication after the work of Thomas Hubel, who I've been studying with for some years now. For me, that's the causative agent. Like when we titrate some of that into the space, that's when all kinds of material that's ready, that's ripe to be harvested or released starts to surface. And that's when there's a kind of intelligence that begins to operate that's beyond any one individual. That kind of creates little synchronicities and means that what's just been said is exactly what you needed to hear to unlock your next level of process. And there's a sort of beautiful orchestration that we can start to feel into, and becomes very alive and is very nourishing. I anticipate that anyone joining this group will come away from Zoom feeling like really refreshed and energized. It's not like hard. There's a challenge in the work, but there's an energy available when we start to step into this kind of space that is like super energizing as well. So I can feel it now. And I was going to say, listening, like there's something about this dialogue, actually, I would say, that's really starting for me to land. I feel like a groundedness about this conversation that I really appreciate. And men are very good at like concepts and like cognition, like especially philosophers. Like, I mean, by definition, right? It's quite a, classically masculine left brain kind of way of approaching the world. But I feel there's a real quality of groundedness about this conversation that I'm really appreciating, and has a real warmth to it that's really very aligned with the kind of tone that I think we're going to be evoking in the Resonant Man.
Yeah, and I can testify as well to that from doing Dialogos with Jacob, and that kind of transformative power of entering into those types of conversations that might not have like a fixed end point to it in a sense, but you're participating in something that's unfolding, and that can plug you into a lot of things that just, didn't really know existed beforehand. I mean, it is a pulling away of certain veils, which I found the first time when I started doing that very productive, to be honest. Similar to psychedelics in a weird way, which is that it kind of breaks down some of the conceptual apparatus that you're using and allows you to start to see beyond some of the trappings. So that's, I think that's really interesting that you're doing it in a kind of organic, whatever comes up, to have it, because it's quite like therapeutic in a way. A lot of therapies I know don't have that kind of North Star model of like humanist integrative therapies are very focused on like guiding a transformative process, not, specifying the desired outcome of the transformative process necessarily. So that seems quite relevant to what you're doing here, which is cool.
Yeah. I'd love to build on that a little bit as well, and appreciate you saying that, Mahon. I mean, I definitely feel like for me, the Dialogos and the collective wisdom space is where I'm most, like, my intelligence, my wisdom is most alive when I'm tuned into that with other people, without a doubt. Like, that's where I shine. And you can put me in a conversation with someone where that field kind of is just completely shut off. And sometimes, like, I will show up with thoroughly diminished capacity as well, because there isn't that space of potential in which I can kind of come forward and begin to move and operate. And as you say, like, we get things that we couldn't have planned for, and those are often precisely the things we need. Yeah, I like what Matthew's laid out there. That feels like sort of the horizontal plane of what we're operating in. It really is process driven, and it's about cultivating trust in process. And ultimately, there's no prescription of what that brings for each man. And I resonate with the sense that we don't know what becoming looks like for each person is distinct. However, I want to connect it with the Christ piece that you presence, because, this offering is also for me part of a larger landscape, a metamodern conversation about where is the human being going? Where are we developing in this time? And for me, there is something really essential about this collective capacity building for kind of human evolution that I sense is occurring in this time. And you've probably heard the phrase, the next Buddha is the Sangha, going around quite a lot recently. And I apply that in a Christian context as well. I feel the next Christ is the
Body.
collective body. It's the collective consciousness. Um, and so that actually dovetails very well because it's not that sort of North Star of coming into a communion of body and spirit, of coming into a place where your spiritual life and your soul is fully in relation with or as fully as possible whilst still being in your body. And that's really anchored right down into the fibers of your body and, into your physicality, into your sexuality, into your day-to-day conduct. Um, and it's that meeting in the middle that I associate with kind of Christ and the center of the cross. It's where flesh and spirit, where body, mind, and soul are all kind of coming together. And there's something about the collective body, the group, that affords us to do that and to realize that. And um, spiritual realization and awakening can be a very lonely thing, especially when the experiences we have or the changes we're going through, we can't articulate them, or the people around us cannot receive them. And so it's really, really important to have friends and brothers who actually can see us in our humanity and see us just, see us as Jacob and Matthew, but can also see with that deeper vision, with that third eye, with that soul gaze that can see, oh, I can sense the the Christ self, the higher self that is coming through you. And insofar as we can see that in one another, I think that nothing could transform culture more radically than that. To be seen in that and to realize that collectively is, um, yeah, possibly the great adventure of this life for me.
And it seems like the proper spirit to orient a group as you're going through that work, in a sense of like exactly what Matthew's saying, of like you don't want to force a top-down ideology on people, but also that spirit of love and openness and truth is something that you're following in a sense as well. And because you mentioned, Jacob, a horizontal axis, I mean that vertical axis of the virtues of processing wisdom, temperance, justice, courage, like all of those things on that kind of progress to a better self, whatever. I mean, you want to describe that. I think most people would agree that those virtues are pretty good. And if we could embody them, that's, developmentally makes sense. And I think that is part of the Dialogos practice anyway, is really focused on those virtues. Like it is on, understanding the virtues in more nuanced ways and the vices, so you can recognize them in yourself and in others. And by recognizing them in some sense, you kind of can start to use them in a way, or they become more part of you. So I really think that's what self-development is like. Um, so I think you're both bringing something very exciting there to it that makes a really powerful combo.
Yeah, and that was a beautiful articulation, Jacob, of the bigger vision, the cultural transformational dimension of this work. I loved how you how you expressed that. It was very clear and actually landed in me maybe even more deeply than in our past discussions. And I wanted to also add to your model, your vertical horizontal integration, the kind of yes, certainly the vertical connection to soul, higher self, spirit, and the vertical connection downwards into the ancestral domain and the earth, and really being
Mm.
grounded in that. And for me, ancestors are, or connecting with my ancestors, recognizing their ancestral nervous system, if you like, that I'm a part of, is new. It's still fairly new. And I've had a chance to do some quite deep work around that in the last year or two. But it's become very real to me in a way that it wasn't before. It was just offline completely until I had that opportunity. So I even just starting that dimension without necessarily knowing how we interact with it, or like what to do with it, or how to move around in relation to it, just to acknowledge that there is an ancestral reality. And however we conceptualize that, like there's many different ways we could think about what that really means, but just to open that question, I think, is already a powerful step. And it's actually a step we took at the very beginning of our friendship when we met over this question of how the trauma of World War One or World War Two lives on from our ancestors in us. And so it feels quite, although it's not something necessarily, we're not like necessarily presenting this as a kind of ancestral healing experience directly, in a way that that is very much there. That there is that element that I think we can, and which again we need to approach in community. Yes, we can do ancestral work on our own, but we're doing it together really can evoke something very powerful, I think.
And
No,
it ties back into the meaning crisis as well, I think, in term I like the idea of trauma. I tend to think about it in the Janice Bullman way of shattered assumptions, and the
Mm.
death of God and the meaning crisis was really the shattering of a world view that made sense of our lives. And I think World War One and World War Two are definitely connected to that. The competition of ideologies for who's going to be in charge. And I think we're still living in the shadow of that. Like I don't think we've reform those assumptions, to be honest, into a viable worldview. So for young people, young men growing up now, that's again, I suppose, back to this the shattered, fractured element of you know, growing up in a world that doesn't have a coherent worldview, and how that does traumatize you. Like it just dysregulates your nervous system because you're under threat all the time. So yeah, I think
mm,
that's very much connected to each other.
yeah, it's and also an assault of addictive technologies at every corner, which is a completely novel threat as well to our self-regulation and becoming and wholesomeness. Um, and yeah, also just appreciating, as you said that, Mahon, like it's such a rarefied gift to hear that said and understood. And I know it's taken you and I like a journey of many years to get to articulating that, but now a young man can come along and potentially like I don't know to what extent skip that process, but like to actually encounter those ideas already formulated and embodied is enormous. And maybe that can move along the process even further. Um, but I just wanted to turn back to Matthew because I really feel like I can feel the map, and we've been engaging in various creative practices of kind of mapping the landscape of the resonant man. Um, and this is one of those kind of maps, is that sensibility of uh, I consider it to be sort of we're in this kind of liminal space of confusion. Below us, we have modernity, shattered, fragmented, in its attitudes, in the inheritance of war, pre-modernity going down, and then right at the bottom, kind of an indigenous quality of knowing. That's kind of like the deeper ancestral code. And then above us, kind of just beyond this kind of liminal confusion, is a metamodern space. There's a possibility of something new coming in. And so the resonant man for us is kind of at this cross section between the future and the past, and he's drawing up, he's kind of uploading from the ancestral layer. And I think plant medicine and I think the kind of medicine of masculinity can bring that forth in mysterious ways, and also downloading from the future. And as we clear out the energetic blocks in our systems, we become more readily able to feel that coming through. And that's something I felt in the last few years, like at a very physical level, like unlocking like sensory capacities, like sensing from my chest and not just from my head, sensing from my heart, like feeling my heart, feeling my balls, feeling energy in my balls. Like I've had a lot of interesting spiritual experiences in the last year in which I really felt activation and energy coming into my balls and a kind of sanctification of what that is. And I still don't understand it, but what I received from a friend on retreat who I talked about it with is like that's seed energy, and there is something sacred that we carry as men.
Life, man.
Life itself, held within us, and the potential of life, both literally within our seed, but also like metaphorically exapted. Like we have the capacity to gift our life energy and seed into the world. And the more that we can realize that and respect that and cultivate it, the more of a gift we become as men to our communities and to women and to families and to all of it.
Definitely. And I agree. There's something interesting coming up there, which is the overcoming of the kind of shame that's been put on men in recent years. Like the
Mm.
cultural critique of the West has become very focused on that just men are at the root of all evil, which is an absurd idea because it equates something immutable, being male, with ethics, which is based on what you do. It's not something that you can be literally. And so I think overcoming that stigma, I suppose, or like this, because we all kind of grow up with this heavy sense of like there's something wrong with men, we shouldn't be men, traditional masculinity is somehow bad. Um, Probably because of the wars of the 20th century in large part as well. And that's a heavy burden to bear, I think, as a man. Finding a way to accept yourself as a man, to carry that seems to be really key to this puzzle as well, which might have something to do with the balls, the, the healing energy. But yeah,
What I'm sure Matthew wants to speak on this, but I just want to kind of ground that down a little bit whilst we're into the territory. Is like I didn't feel that ball's energy until the last few years, and I'm 28 now. So there are ways of dwelling in our bodies as men that we don't just that doesn't just come automatically with being a man. There's a kind of coming into ourselves. And the more you tune into that process, the more you start to appreciate, like, the more I'm in me and the way I'm dwelling in myself as a man, that is constantly being reflected and mirrored back by women and be people in the environment. And a lot of what I would say immature masculinity has been is just all cock energy and no balls energy. And those are kind of like physical instantiations of like, I'm going to be a massive cock and
Facade.
go out and show myself off and make this big show. But there isn't that like deep indwelling, that rest, that kind of gravitational center of like, here I am. I don't need to show anything off. I'm just, I'm just fully here in me. So I wanted to presence that piece as well.
I don't know if
Yeah,
you wanted to jump in, Matthew, but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. There's just so much to respond to. I mean, I think this question of shame and the burden of being a man in the moment we're in is really powerful question as well. Like how much of the that sea we're swimming in when we don't even realize it's affecting us or limiting us or informing our own narrative internally about ourselves without us even knowing. And a couple of things that I've I've learned in men's groups are that a lot of men are very wary of other men, which I is not something I really hold, but which I know is very common, and there's obvious reasons for that. And that's something that we need to account for and welcome, and we need to welcome that reticence, that wariness, and allow that to be part of the journey that we're on. And because that has an intelligence to it, that wariness is there for a reason. And there's an opportunity for men who are carrying a lot of that reticence, that wariness, to really allow that to start to liquefy a little bit, and that kind of internal structure, that defensive orientation, and start to melt, I think. And I'm also thinking of mothers. I mean, a lot of us, again, not so much my experience, but there's many men who've felt shamed by their own mothers. And that's a pretty deep wound to carry. And I really believe that in a men's group, when we hit a kind of, there's a certain point we hit where we can be the fathers and brothers for each other that we may never have had, and probably didn't have, actually, almost certainly didn't have in our traumatized cultures. We can actually be those figures. We can bring the father energy or the brother energy that would have been really helpful in those moments where we suffered those wounds. And the fact it wasn't there is actually why those experiences became wounds, or those deficits left us marked in some way. And so there's a real beauty in that. I've seen that in another men's group, really recognizing like the frozenness in my male lineage, my grandfather, my father, for various reasons, war, but also other factors at play. And recognizing how I was able to melt that, for that frozenness to start to really thaw as a result of the connections I was having with other men who were, in a sense, representations of my father or my grandfather. And there was a beauty in that process that actually really improved my relationship with my actual father in a really extraordinary way. And so there can be a real subtlety and beauty in this work when we just allow ourselves to enter the field and participate as best we can. There is a blessing that I think we can start to access in that moment that can really work on us in ways that we would never be able to predict, because we don't know what it is we don't know until we're making ourselves available to this kind of work. So although we've named some of the wounds and some of the challenges, I really want to honor how much potential there is to really transform, transcend, and include, to learn to host these wounds differently and to help one another to do that. Like there is a miracle available, actually. And I don't say that lightly.
That defrosting as well that you're talking about, Matthew, so rings so true in terms of relationships. I think that it's so important for having an intimate relationship, a long-term relationship, that you are capable of that. Because if you're not, it's going to be very hard to relate to your partner and to have an actual functioning relationship. And I think I see that a lot with the defensiveness. Friends, you just like, communication breaks down. It's hard for things to work. It's hard to actually feel connected to somebody, really, if you're in that kind of I don't know what you call it, a scarcity or zero sum mindset of just everything's, out to get you. And so maybe being able to do that in one circumstance translates to those other domains, probably, where you can do it in, like what me and Jacob have done in Dialogos, and then that assists in your other relationships. Because it really is the core of connecting to people.
Yeah, I say that's a foundational principle and understanding for Matthew and I, is that it does translate, it does move across. And the very capacity to like tune in deeply, be really present to what's going on, not knowing where it's going to go, like that is probably one of the best kits that you can download and bring to a conversation with your spouse, because if you can stay with that, you know, the very, very finely tuned correspondences that often exist between us and our partners, us and our soulmates, like there's kind of ancestral lines there as well. And when we can tune into that, like the soulmate partnership becomes this place where, you know, healing and awakening is happening between men and women as well. Um, and that was a really deep response to Mahon's question, but I also realized we kind of didn't answer directly at the cultural level. So I wanted to do that as well. Um, yeah, we feel that as well. And we've walked with that. And I I think having participated in this work for so long, I've reached a place where I don't actually have fear to kind of stand in that like necessity and value of what we're engaging in as men. And I think that's a very critical first piece, is just like not being kind of kowtowed into fear. And there are still a lot of, you know, adult men who would be afraid to be associated with something like this because they are sensing into a cultural climate of attack and reaction that is directed around these themes, and, you know, even penetrates into workplaces and companies and all of this stuff. Like, this is a real cultural force we're contending with. But it's a cultural force that ultimately has a kind of trauma at its heart, and that has to be met in kind. It has to be met at a deeper level. We're not looking for a kind of politically reactive, immature backlash of like, we're going to be the boys and go and do our own thing and fuck all of you lot.
No girls allowed.
No girls
Boys
allowed.
Club.
I'm just Ken. No, it's deeply in service of women. It's in service of healing the collective cultural wounds, which we see as really deeply associated with what people are pointing at when they're saying patriarchy, like that sense of power through separation, power through domination, like a deep sense of, yeah, like what it means to be a man being based upon a kind of domination of the external world and a rejection of interiority, and a kind of leaving and putting all of that onto women. Like, I'm not going to ever feel my own feelings except when I find myself with a woman, and then she's going to be kind of responsible for dealing with that. And I'm not going to co-regulate that. I'm not going to develop that with other men, because we don't do that. That's dangerous or homoerotic or threatening or any of those things. Yeah, this to me represents the evolution that gets us out of this paralyzing, exhausting cultural situation of being at each other and not being able to actually celebrate and ennoble one another as men, as women, as divine bodies that bring together, you know, the greater masculine, the divine masculine, and the divine feminine. And we need to have both. And we believe that there's a kind of there's a warrior spirit that's available to us as men that isn't rooted in that kind of separation that you could consider kind of drove the First World War and drove that kind of insane conflict where you have European Christian men with very similar cultures just massacring each other on scale in the name of nation states. There's a way in which we can be connected with our warrior, and our warrior is deeply connected to spirit. It's deeply connected to the earth. It's deeply connected to who we're serving, what we're standing for. And I believe that we're in a climate that actually demands that, like the possibility of new forms of tyranny, the possibility of new civilizational breakdown is upon
No
us.
shortage of problems, all right. Plenty of wars
No
to fight.
shortage of problems and an enormous shortage of real male embodied leadership that's rooted in the feminine. And that's the new wave. That's what gets us into a new place. And this is a first step in that direction.
Wow. You put it so much better than I could, Jacob. I could never capture that in that way, but it's absolutely what I agree with. And I was thinking as you were speaking, like, even for me, like to post it on LinkedIn that I'm doing a men's group has a kind of edgy feeling to it. Because as you say, we're in this culture where we're so contested and it could be misunderstood. Or I wonder, like, what are all the people who aren't liking this thinking? Like, the idea that the men are now oppressed and need to kind of band together to survive. That's obviously not what this is about. And I loved how you expressed what it is about. But I just wanted to own that there is that free song of like, am I allowed to have a men's group? Is it kind of acceptable in
but it's such a crazy
society?
idea of like men working on themselves should be rejected. Like, do you want men that are incapable of like relating to other people? Like, I've always found that side of things very pathological, to be honest, in a sense of almost just like there's a very large like cultural critique going on there that doesn't really have men's well-being or development at it as a goal. Like, it doesn't really care about that, in fact. And a lot of the advice and the ideas don't really lead to men having better lives. And men that have better lives, that are advancing themselves, will be better sons, they'll be better fathers, they'll be better boyfriends, they'll be better leaders. It's insane to think that a society could function without men that are advancing themselves and improving. Like, and so, they have to find some way of doing it. And men's groups obviously seems to be a way of scratching that itch.
And to be fair, I haven't actually directly encountered any criticism or hostility over it. Like, it's more in my mind that I'm venturing across a sort of unspoken edge by sharing this. And actually, it's often the women who are the first to comment and celebrate the idea of this work. So I do feel there's a lot of receptivity, but nonetheless, like there's still a little, I have to overcome a little hump of resistance to put it out there from that, like Jacob said, that field. We're in this field where there's a lot of contestation over this, and we don't want to get drawn into the crossfire inadvertently.
You don't want to become part of the manosphere.
No, exactly. And also that's it. I think that's, you've made the point that, there are these really unhealthy, really, really shadow masculine figures and trends that are identifiable. And it would be, the danger, I guess, is feeling oneself to be almost conflated by that, by default almost. But I don't think that's what's happening. But I guess there is, maybe that's part of what is my hesitation at moments. It's like, are they going to think that I'm kind of Andrew Tate, which obviously isn't the case. But yeah, because that's out there, it just feels like it's a kind of, you have to be very clear about what it is and isn't. But I admire you, Jacob, because you just have no truck for that. Like, like you embolden me to not kind of get caught up in worrying about whether I might get misinterpreted. And I appreciate that courage.
Well, to speak to my own journey, I can say that there's been many, many, many junctures where I took a step that I thought was going to bring down hell and fury or completely transform how people perceived me, and consistently almost nothing happens. So yeah, until you become someone of real power and influence, then the swarms come for you, and then you really better have cultivated that courage step by step along the way to actually take your stand. Because when you have voice that has impact, there are people who come to undermine that. Yeah,
definitely. But there is that, I think there's the good side of that manosphere kind of early thing that like Jordan Peterson was so intrinsic in me, really like changing my life and like so important. And then you hear him lumped in with Andrew Tate, and you're like, well, they're not the same. Like, you know, there's qualitative levels to this, and side of that manosphere is very materialistic, teaching men to be like avoidant personality types that just lie to women to manipulate them. It's not really a good long-term strategy. Like, so I think he can separate like the good ones from the bad ones based like, you know, pretty easily. And yeah, so I think it's just, yeah, propaganda, isn't it, that you get lumped in together with something like that. It doesn't necessarily reflect on people that are doing good work for men.
Mm. Yeah, it reminds me what was coming up when you were speaking, Mahon, about this kind of like there's this reactive force that isn't interested in men's becoming. And when I feel into like where is that really coming from, I think it's the trauma of a cultural history where that was what was done to women. And it's a context in which there were men who didn't want their women to be empowered. They wanted their women to be dependent upon them. And so, you know, just a few generations later, we go through this kind of like reversal, and this often happens in collective trauma patterns. Like you go from being an oppressed victim to trying to enact what you experienced upon your perceived oppressor. And there's this awful reversal and polarization that occurs. And once you begin to understand those dynamics and the kind of science of trauma that me and Matthew are engaged in, you start to see how that governs a lot of the culture war landscape. And so giving people a kind of fluency in that and being able to kind of read that layer helps a lot. And ultimately, yeah, I think women who are connected with themselves, connected with their bodies, connected with their purpose, connected with their spirituality, want men who are connected with themselves, their bodies, and their purpose and their spirituality, and stand on their own 2 feet. And that's ultimately the most attractive and desirable thing for a partner and for a father and for a leader in culture. And truth shines with its own resonance.
Yeah,
And those
I
were the
agree.
days to
I
hear.
just think there's also an element of painting a picture of the past as this oppressor oppressed narrative of like men oppressed women in the past. Like if you talk to your grandmother probably doesn't think she's oppressed. Like your grandmother's probably like, we had a nice time. It was actually like pretty fine. Like their lives are very different. Like in Ireland in the 1950s, like it was like a third world country. Like it's a totally different place. Like if we project the things we do now back to there, it's going to look ridiculous. But like they were people doing the best with what they had. Some of them were cunts, some of them were not nice to each other and were abusive. But I don't think everybody was abusing each other. You know what I mean? Like there were people loved each
Mm,
other. Like love isn't
mm,
a modern invention. You know what I mean? Like it's not, if anything, we struggle to love each other more now, I would say, because we're more selfish. So I think there's plenty of examples of men and women in the past who have unbelievable relationships. My grandfather's currently in hospital and my granny's going in to see him every day and, you know, trying to take care of him, even though she can barely take care of herself. And it's like heartbreaking to see, but they've done everything for each other and they were born, you know, in the 1920s. Like, so I think there's an element of, there's a bit of an illusion there going on that men and women are adversarial in some way when really we're complementary to each other. Like, we're really made for each other. Like, we're not meant to have this, you know, intergender civil war that's been going on for the last while. So yeah, that was just something that was coming up.
I think that's really beautiful. And it's really important to include that. And I was just thinking the other day, like, where my mind sometimes goes archetypally, like, how many true loves have there been throughout all of history? Like, if you think of man and woman as expressions of the divine, you know, how many times has true love found its other? How many times has it found its face throughout time immemorial? And as you say, you know, men and women have come together to face enormous hardship throughout history. and serving one another. And that's what the institution of marriage, in its highest form was about. It was about devotion and service to one another. It wasn't about um, ownership and domination of one another. Um, and it's important that we rescue the good and true from the past and not project backwards a kind of revolutionary, painful further in simplification, and being equipped with philosophy and the capacity to dialogue and distinguish and make sense together is part of the toolkit that men are being deprived of today, and women as well. And we need to develop that in that capacity. And I think that actually eventually creates the context where, when these illusions come to rise in conversation, we can address them. Um, yeah, and also just sending love to your grandfather and your grandmother, and it's very yeah, it's very heartening to hear about that kind of later life bond and devotion as well.
Yeah, it's inspirational, man. It's unbelievable to see, really. They could be married for, my granddad's 89 now. So they've been married for like 58 years or something like that, or when they were like 20. And I think that's something, because like for me as man, I want to be a father, I want to be a husband, choosing that relationship. Your relationship to women is very important, and to a woman, you might be able to get lots of women, but keeping one of them is a different story. You do need to be able to go deeper on that. So I think for men, uh, our culture oscillates between that, like Andrew Tate, get a million women, or like, just stay at home in your room and play video games. There is another way that might be better for you.
Any closing thoughts here, Matthew?
I've really felt very I felt like this dialogue has clarified for me why I'm doing this. It's brought some new language to that, which is really powerful. And at the same time, it's really reminded me of the tenderness of it as well, and the the beauty of the work in the moment as we do it, but also the what follows from and grows from it. And also very touched, Mahon, by your example of your grandparents, and really wanting to send them both whatever energies we can send from our dialogue to support them, and really honor their example. I mean, there's a real it's a beautiful way for us to close, I think, to really honor them and all they've been through, and all that commitment. Something very
Inspirational, man.
very
Thank you.
powerful about that. Yeah. So I'll rest it there. Thank you. And I've really enjoyed meeting you.
And thank you both as well. I mean, I'm excited to see more as you keep going. Sounds like you've really got something that's really needed, and you're brave for putting it out there for all the reasons we've established. So, uh, yeah, good luck, and I'm excited to see where it goes, and hopefully you can participate at some point and get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mahon. We're definitely seeing this as a long horizon project, and a project for culture, not just for the initial group of men joining us this June, from June 9th. And yeah, it's taken some courage, but mostly it's really just brought us alive, and we can feel the aliveness and the current and the sense of potential, and that's what's driving us to create this space and invite others into it. So yeah, it's been absolutely cracking, and just as I predicted, you've brought out so many dimensions and really rooted this down into the current context very well. So thank you as always, Mahon. And yeah, we're always happy to keep developing these themes, and have you participating at some point as well.
Glad I could be of some use, dudes. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, man.